Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our Tuesday conversation. Today, Damon and I are going to kind of do a follow-up a little bit from last week. If you recall, I kind of pitched the idea of us having a conversation about the relationship between science and religion. So that's kind of where we're going to pick up where we left off in that sense. So, Damon, as we start, just give us a little bit. I know a lot of people do know your background in this area, but if you could kind of let folks know, kind of
Okay.
your, yeah.
So I have 2 degrees in molecular biology, a bachelor's and a master's degree. I have been steeped in science and math my whole life. My mom was a nurse. My father was a research scientist. And so it's just always been a part of who I am and what I was interested in studying. And so I'm classically trained in biology and a little bit in chemistry and some physics. I enjoy doing theoretical physics as a hobby. So science was always a big part of my life. I taught high school biology for 10 years. Just have always been steeped in that area of knowledge. It wasn't, again, like I kind of said last week, until I was in my late 20s before I really took my faith seriously and began to study, and very much from a scientific perspective. Study the scriptures, study my pastor's sermons, those kind of things. And I was amazed to discover I had sort of grown up some with the idea that faith and science are antithetical to each other. Now, again, we didn't delve into a lot of that in my family.
Because you grew up Roman Catholic, right? Okay.
Grew up Roman Catholic, but very nominally so.
Yeah, okay.
So we didn't have a lot of these kinds of conversations. But in my mind, they were separate. And I didn't have the sort of argumentative faith against science or science against faith. They were compartmentalized. This was science, this was faith. You know, the two don't really combine or clash or whatever. So I really hadn't any of those kinds of issues or problems with the two being opposed to one another. It was when I began to study faith that I began to hear those conversations. And for me, the conversation was all, I don't see the opposition. I see 2 different ways of telling the story of creation, which we're going to get into today here in just a few minutes. And so I didn't really grow up with an ethos of adversarial parts between faith and science. I heard about it, but never really bought into it.
Yeah. So it's interesting you mentioned your background as a Roman Catholic, because one of the even though I was raised evangelical, I'll talk about that in a little bit. One of the classic cases of church versus science is certainly the story of Galileo and being excommunicated for his work. And then later on, Copernicus actually had a good relationship with the Roman Catholic Church, but Protestants were ones who took issue with him in that sense. So from your perspective, just briefly, what is your perception of kind of that historic moment? How do you view that?
Yeah, whether it was Galileo, Copernicus, Newton, Gregor Mendel, who's the father of modern genetics, was actually a Franciscan priest.
Okay.
And so there were plenty of great figures in history that were faithful to the Roman Catholic Church and yet were scientists. I think where it began to be a problem was when the church, and by this we really do mean the Roman Catholic Church, the Roman Church began to see the modern advances in science as being competition for not just faithfulness, dedication. You know, we're gonna put my faith in terms of my learning, which again was so strange because there was so much about like the Jesuits. You know, we're just steeped in learn, a very strong part of the Catholic Church. And so for me, it grew into this almost a power struggle between who are you going to believe, because what grew up in that was you can't believe both.
Yeah.
And again, I struggled when I was learning that myself for the first time to say, I don't see why I have to choose. But I think that's historically where a lot of that came from, was a vying for power in terms of what are the masses going to believe.
Yeah, and I think, that to me is a fundamental kind of, if someone might ask, what is my core, the core kind of grist in the mill for me as I kind of seek to maybe rethink how we perceive of our faith. I think the issue of choosing a lower power over a higher power is core for me. And I think so many things emanate from that, and so many ways in which then our theology gets put in a box, or because for the interest of kind of protecting it for a certain type of power, not for an interest in truth. And so, because what I'm hearing you say, and this is, I'm not going to put words in your mouth, but my experience has been, as I have studied these things, and this topic or other topics, it has recast my faith in some ways, and it has certainly changed the things in which I say, well, that's absolutely got to be the way that is. That some of those things have gotten softer, but in general, I would say the overall effect has been to expand my understanding of God and my faith. It's gotten bigger and wider in that way, and so for me, and I think again, perhaps you would say the same thing. It would be hard for you if someone said, no, you have to choose. It would, well, yeah, right. Because for you, you'd be saying, well, this is a whole science. Again, science is a way of me understanding the natural world and the gift of God. So why would I give that up?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so, again, looking at the scientists that I studied, and then once becoming a pastor, looking at the faithful people of God that I studied and seeing, I understand historically where the adversity came from. Just wasn't buying into it.
Yeah.
I just see the Psalm 8, or we're going to talk about Genesis 1, as being complementary rather than adversarial to one another.
Right. So just to kind of cast forward, because this whole topic could be its own podcast, its own series. This is a huge topic. So one thing for you all to know, we've already made an agreement. We're not going to talk about COVID today. There are other times to talk about that, but we're going to limit our conversation today really to three primary topics. One, creation and evolution, Genesis and then evolution. Two, what I'm calling kind of the interconnectedness of the natural world and what science is showing us about just how connected we are. And then finally, and this kind of goes back to last week I mentioned a documentary called Heal. And so I'm going to actually take a second here and put the link to the trailer for that documentary on the comments. If I can find that, I'll take a little break. But and one little caveat to that is just for you to know, the trajectory of that documentary was even challenging for me. It comes from a perspective, I won't typify, I'll just let you take it in, but it certainly comes from a perspective that I don't normally trust, and I'm like, oh, it's not in my wheelhouse as it goes, but there's some fascinating information in the documentary. Certainly, I suspect there was some pseudoscience in that documentary.
Okay.
But as it landed, and again, I don't want to give that away either, but where it landed, it so reminded me of our conversation last week regarding Satan and evil. Where it lands is a place where we would be as well. In agreement, and not only in agreement, but in agreement with having presented a scientific justification, especially a scientific justification for prayer, which is fascinating, which, by the way, I know I said we wouldn't talk about COVID. I'm going to try to find, we can share this too. I saw NPR had a story this week about a study regarding prayer and COVID. It was fascinating, already those things kind of coming out. So I'm going to put that link on there for folks. But again, just knowing it's going to challenge many of you in terms of, it may feel a little woo-woo and a little bit funky, but it's going to be it's fascinating to me to end up in the same place. So I'm going to go ahead and do that
I'll
right
take
now.
a look at it as well.
But so I know that you have been asked, you mentioned that you've been asked to kind of talk about Genesis 1 and science, and give us a little bit about your perception of that as a pastor and as a student of science.
Okay. Again, I grew up with the science part. I knew the creation story, but again, we didn't really take our faith very seriously when I was growing up. So, but the science I took very seriously, and understood the sort of classic form of what we call phylogenetic evolution. And I will tell you from the beginning that this may throw off many people from thinking who I am as well. I believe evolution as a process is a fact. I don't think that's a theory. It is a matter of how species change from one to another, and we see that. I think there's plenty of scientific fact for that. The evolutionary theory is what we call phylogenetic theory. This idea that amphibians at some point gave rise to reptiles, and then reptiles gave rise on one hand to birds, on another hand to mammals. I still put those in the idea of theory because there's just not the archaeological evidence yet to support that and say this is fact.
Okay.
There's plenty of evidence there to say, wow, isn't this interesting? Can we connect these dots? And I think it's an appropriate connecting of those dots. So even in my own being steeped in the understanding of phylogenetic evolution, I can see it, and I have no problem with that. What happened then was, as I began to study Genesis chapter 1 and look at here's what happened on day 1, here's what happened on day 2, and that sort of, I was amazed as a scientist to look at the list and go, that follows the pattern.
Okay.
Now, thousands and thousands of years ago, this story was told.
Yeah.
It took 1,000 years for anybody to actually write it down, the Genesis 1 story. So nobody was thinking evolution or phylogenetic evolution or anything like that. Mark and I had a conversation a little earlier about one of the problems with the argument here of being, the questions I usually get asked are things like, well, was a day really 24 hours back then? And did these things really happen in its order? And what I know talking to Jewish rabbis was to say, if you ask those kinds of questions, you're asking the wrong questions. You're missing the point of the story. Genesis 1 was not meant to be a scientific look at the process of the first 6 days of creation. It was storytelling. And the point of the storytelling was to say, look how incredible our God is. Simply speaks and things come into existence. It's an amazing idea of looking at the power of God to do these things. And so I had no problem with that. But as a scientist, then I looked at that series of the first 6 days and thought, it fits. It fits classic phylogenetic evolution patterns.
Okay.
This part came first, and then came these, and then came these plants, and then came these animals. It fit. And so for me, it was simply a different telling of the same story. And the way that I've explained it to a lot of people is look at history, because I like to study American history especially. And we're all aware of the great Longfellow story poem, The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. Okay? So we have that. I've also looked at it in terms of history. The poem is wonderful, but it's not entirely historically accurate. The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere was done by 5 or 6 people, including a woman. He just had one part of it, then he was captured and arrested, and so you don't learn that from the poem. You learn it from reading the history books of that. But it's telling the same story.
Right.
And so for me, it was the evolution, Genesis 1, they're telling the same story. And with a whole different reason in mind. One is to say, here's how we think scientifically these things happened. One is to say, here's the power behind that science. Here is the God who gave it the force, the power for all that to happen.
So last week we talked about the word myth. And that the notion of a story, and you pointed out, which was helpful, that we often think of something in our context, if you say it's a myth, it's not true,
Right.
But that's simply a story for a historical account, in a sense. So to that end, I think I might hear you say you have to separate the words factual versus true. Something can still be true. It's not designed to be factual. In other words, that
Scientifically
account.
factual.
Yes.
Right.
So my next question with regards to well, first of all, before that one, what are your thoughts on the singularity or the Big Bang, how it relates to your theology?
Right, and much in the same way. When I study the singularity and you look at this place where, for those of you that are also kind of new to the physics, the quantum singularity is the idea that before the Big Bang happened, all the mass of everything, of the entire cosmos, was in this very, very small area held together by gravity, and then finally it exploded, and you have the beginning of light as you get photons being created. To me, that's, in the beginning, God said, let there be light, and there was light. To me, it fit.
Yeah.
The question that science doesn't answer then is, okay, so you have all this mass that's there, so where'd the mass come from?
Yeah.
And science can't answer that question.
Right. That's
and
the
so
classic,
I look
something from nothing.
Something from nothing,
Yeah.
right. And so then religion, my faith comes and says, oh, I know where it came from. I know the source of all its mass. And then you have, like you said, the quantum singularity. You have this huge explosion that we call the Big Bang Theory. And this is the beginning of the creation story. To me, day one.
Uh-huh.
God says, let there be light. There was light.
I know you've mentioned before, a little bit last week and certainly in our conversations, the role of mystic practice in your faith. So, give us just a brief picture of that, because then I have a follow-up question about it. But tell us a little bit about the role of mysticism and meditation in your practice.
Again, coming to faith as a scientist, I had a very limited way of looking at Scripture, and it wasn't until I had become a pastor and I began to read about the mystics. And again, that's another one of those words that's packed like myth is.
Sure.
Mystic is simply a very deep form of prayer that sort of takes over you. It's not that you pray mystically, but you are prayed. It's another topic for another day, perhaps. But that idea of here was another side of prayer life that I didn't know about, this deeper form of prayer. Part of it is because if you want to talk about the way we're wired and that sort of thing, I'm so steeped in science that this is a part of my brain that is not, let's say as functional, it's just not as powerful as the scientific side of my brain. And so I have to kind of work at it.
Well, meditation is to try to transcend the mind, right? I mean, in the sense of kind of like getting beyond kind of your conscious mind and your constant...
Okay, and that's where I would go, not the mind, but the conscious part of the mind.
Yeah.
Because I think the mind has all that's inside of it. And so it was opening up this new way of looking at things, of learning things, of experiencing things. It's like the difference between studying air flight and being in a plane. It's a really different experience. And so the mysticism that I began to study, and it was Christian mysticism, going back to the 3rd and 4th centuries, especially the Eastern mystics, was a way of thinking about God that didn't seem to come naturally to me. It still doesn't. And so that's something I have to work at. And so I have all these books that I study and I read and I go to the practices and all this. It's not something that comes naturally to me in the same way that sort of music and all that comes naturally to you. I will tell you folks, I have been a great admirer of Mark's because of the way we will look at things that we're trying to produce in worship and all that. And I will have the scientific mind of, these lights do this and this has this effect or whatever. And then Mark comes in and says, yes, but here's the ambiance it creates. That wouldn't have entered my head. And so I have to rely on somebody like Mark who really does think with the right side of his brain more than I do with the left side of my brain. And so they become, again, complementary to one another. I'm using more and more of my brain as I study mysticism, as it becomes a part of that. And so the same thing can be said then of the larger picture of faith and science. It's engaging as much of my brain as possible to be faithful to God.
What do you think, so with you having established the importance of mysticism in your practice, being a great respecter of the scientific method, as those two things sit beside one another, let me ask you this question. To you, what has been the cost of those who have attempted, and certainly there have been benefits to systematic theology, but to you, what has been the cost of a rigid attempt to apply scientific method to Scripture? The fullness of what you can gain spiritually. And because I think you can gain things spiritually through scientific thought. And I think you can gain things spiritually through the arts, through mysticism, through these kinds of practices. I think these are all roads, means, or whatever to find out our deeper spiritual self. And so spirituality doesn't have to be located only in the scientific exploration of the Scriptures, nor only located in the experiential of prayer or mysticism. It engages both. The Spirit's not limited by one or the other. We limit ourselves in that. And so what I gained in that is the fullness. What I think we miss is if we locate ourselves in just one, we're actually missing out on some of the great benefits of God, the great blessings of God to show us what the greater spiritual life has for us as we draw closer to Jesus Christ and become even more aware of who we are, not just as physical beings or mental beings, but who we are as spiritual beings. One of the things I've said in my other classes is, do you see yourself as a physical being, have a spiritual experience,
or do you see yourself as
Yeah.
a spiritual being having a physical
Right,
experience?
sure.
And I like to say yes. I like both because we are heart, mind, soul, body, spirit. You can't separate any of those from each other.
Yeah, I would answer that. I'm okay with saying yes, but I would lean toward the latter. I'm more. I find that I am more who I was made to be when I lean into my identity as a soul, as opposed to purely a body. But I'm also, very much. You know me well enough to know that I talk a lot about mind, body, and spirit, and those
Right.
connections and how important that is. So, because another thing I would have to add to what you're saying is, I think historically, we are at a point. We've talked about this 500-year rummage sale Adam and I have, and this whole notion of kind of this, the rise of the nuns, and this kind of this fascinating point where we are in history, the history of the church. I think one of the primary, I'll mention two things that I think are kind of primary points of before and after. One, as I've said before, East and West. This reckons we have been so westernized in our perception that is correcting. Where we're saying no. The full truth transcends East and West, and so that's one thing. The second thing I would say, and it kind of follows that, is that I think we're at a place historically where we're realizing. Enlightenment and logic and reason. And this isn't just in terms of religion, but in terms of our attempts to explain the natural world. They have limits.
Yes.
And what's fascinating is there are some really thoughtful atheists and agnostics who I love to hear talk. A couple, Penn Jillette's one, another is Ricky Gervais. And what's interesting is both of them, their aesthetic, their cosmetics can be off-putting. They've kind of got this craft, but when you hear them really unpack, and by the way, speaking of Ricky Gervais, if you haven't seen Afterlife, the second season of his show on Netflix is amazing. It's a great picture of what it is to mourn and to live after you've lost someone. But anyway, they both have really heralded what they believe to be the bravery of science to say, we don't know. And what's fascinating is I agree, I hear that, I resonate with that, and that would be something I would also say, I think that a thoughtful Christian would also say, we don't know. There are things that we can't, we can say we have these, but we don't know for sure, and that's okay. That's that mystery, right?
Yes.
And I think that's the, and not to reduce this, but there are kind of two ways to approach the unknown. And we're going to get to this, on Sunday, Adam's going to figure this all out for us when he says, awaken from fear of the unknown. So by Sunday, this will be done. It was a joke. We need one of those laugh tracks.
No.
Comedy,
There's no rim shots
comedy
here.
in this age is so painful. Anyway, but having said that, there are two ways I think to approach it. One is with a sense of fear, right? And the other is with a sense of wonder and awe and excitement of like, wow, we don't know. Yeah. And I think both of those things can live simultaneously. Perhaps, at the risk of probably speaking out of school here, our lizard brain, our fight and flight response tells us, well, fear is the smarter way to go. Because you'll stay alive if you
can run faster.
Exactly. There you go. Curiosity killed the cat. So anyway, so there's that. Now I'd like to talk a little bit next about what I see as a very important issue where. Especially in the U.S., there's a dissonance between the church and science, and that is in the area of climate change, and I would even go so far as to say the importance of pollution or regulating pollution and of just care for the natural world. I'd like to go first just a little bit as I could kind of set up my perception, a little bit of my concern, and this has been something. Having been raised evangelical, I've mentioned this before, evangelical, very much a connection between politics, governmental politics and church, very much a Republican-based understanding of like that's kind of how we saw that we should see things politically. I remember one of the first dissonances for me, especially, things are just more complicated than we want to think they are. My dad, while he would certainly have identified with everything I just said, he would probably also go pretty far in denying climate change and he would not express a great concern for regulating pollution in terms of I don't think that would keep him up at night. So having said that, the way that my dad taught me to see the world, we would go out from the time I was about 5th or 6th grade all the way through junior high. We had a little boat, or we would go out. We were out in nature constantly.
Okay.
And my dad just absolutely loved nature. I mean, and to explain that to me, and to go, oh, you see this, especially animals, and so, ironically, that was really, to me, looking back, that was a spiritual formation for me, because he was instilling in me something I think was already there naturally, but this great wonder at the natural world that is now, for me as a person who, very much like you, leans into the practice of mysticism. I am seeing the face of God so tangibly. Even though I don't know that my dad ever specifically articulated that, he certainly talked about the natural world and the gift from God. I am communing with God in that way. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting, too. Passing this on to my sons is just beyond amazing. But having said that, so one of the first really tension points for me as I kind of grew out of that perspective was to be how could you hold that? How could both of those things, how can you see the natural world as such a gift from God? Shouldn't you be on the front line of saying, and therefore, we must be stewards of it? And for me, the only explanation I can really understand is because governmental politics so shaded my dad's theology. It really did. It gets back to power, just as you talked about. So that's one of the things for me that is a real concern. And I think that too, we talk about before and after and connection with the nuns and the future of the church. I think that's another corrective personally, that I don't think it's sustainable for the church to continue to what I see as to resist that conversation. But that's my perception. Mm-hmm. Tell me about how you perceive this issue.
Yeah, and I'll begin very wide and narrow down to some of that. You mentioned about correctedness, and science has a history of being self-correcting. Mm-hmm. We discover things, we say, here's what it is, and 30 years, 50 years, 70 years later, we go, oh wait, no it's not, because now we have more information, or we have better tools, or whatever. The church has always also been self-correcting, usually taken longer, and where you and Adam have talked about this 500-year garage sale and that. I've kind of studied that historically for the church. I think it's actually accelerating. I don't think it's 500 years anymore. I think we've seen some that were 500 years apart and then 350 years apart, and I think we're moving into 150-year cycles for that, which I think is a good thing for the church to correct itself on many things, especially the way that we bring the Word of God out to people, the comments we make on, for example, the natural world. Science, like I said, also always self-correcting itself. And so to look at these things and see that there's some that's happening in each that we don't become stagnant in our faith. I absolutely believe the Word of God. I don't think the Word of God needs to be changed, but there's deeper understandings there. And so the self-correction is more a deeper understanding, a deeper way to try and apply what we learn in theology to our world. Now, let's narrow that down some to the natural world, and especially the idea of pollution and climate change and all that. I look at the climate change idea from a scientific perspective and say there are 300,000-year cycles, and there are 15,000-year cycles, there are 5,000-year cycles. We can see all these things by looking at ice cores from the Antarctic and all this kind of stuff, tree rings and these sort of things. The question for me is not so much of whether or not climate change is real. I think it is real. I think we have, million years history of it being real. The question is, how much of it is caused by human interaction with the world? I think scientifically, there's still a lot of argument to be made there. Yes, there is. No, there's not. But from my theological side then, I come at that and go, but we've been left this world as stewards. Mm-hmm. God said from Genesis 1, this is a gift to you. Yeah. Take care of it. And growing up in the 1960s, I remembered, I shared this with Mark, and yes, he's too young to remember this, but Apollo 8, when Apollo 8 swung around the moon and we saw this thing called Earthrise, the first time to see the Earth from that distance coming up over the horizon of the moon, that gave us a whole different picture of how limited the resources of our Earth was. And when that happened in the 1960s, that gave us a whole new picture, I think, of our responsibility for taking care of the Earth. And so you saw a lot of, the rise of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, but you also saw a rise, I think, across the world of people saying, yeah, we need to do better at this. And so you started seeing more regulation of pollution controls and smoke going into the air and stuff being dumped into the seas. I think from a theological perspective, I don't have to take a Republican side or a Democratic side, a conservative side or a side. I can look at it and go, wait. Whether it's causing climate change or not, is this what God expects of me? To dump my trash into the water or into the air? I've been called to do better than this. And so whether I have a government telling me this or pseudoscience or I don't care. I look at it from my theological side and say, I was called to do better than this. And so if it's recycling and if it's putting limits on smokestacks or whatever, I'm willing to do that.
Yeah.
And I don't care what the climate change argument is, more basic than that. I'm called to take care of this earth.
Right.
God said, it's as a gift.
Yeah.
Be good with it.
This is a great example to me of, this keeps coming up for me, orthopraxy versus orthodoxy. And this is an orthopraxy that the human race writ large should share. This is our home.
Yes.
So come on. We're all in this together. Which that phrase is going to set up the next, in the final part of our talk. This kind of refers back to that documentary, but it certainly won't require that you'd seen it. Some believe, with regards to the Big Bang or the singularity, because everything was once connected, it is still connected. Like everything in the natural world is still, and science is bearing out those connections that we never realized. Like I think of some examples of how they've learned that various, like in forests, trees communicate through their roots. All these ways that, which that's a whole other conversation, is consciousness. And the notion of plants and consciousness and what, and I get that opens up a Pandora's box, and then the word soul gets thrown around, all this kind of stuff. But the notion, what I think one
so
is...
So stay tuned for a third segment.
Yeah, I know, right? But I guess what I'm saying is, what is being proven over and over and over again is the interconnectedness of the natural world. And as we sit, though we say we're not going to talk about COVID, as we sit right now, are we not in a new place of awareness of the interconnectedness of the natural world, where we thought we were our islands to ourselves, and no, we aren't. And so, with regards to that, the next little facet I would like to just talk about just a little bit is medicine. And a Western practice of medicine versus an Eastern practice, and more holistic, as we see, quote-unquote, Western medicine becoming more holistic and more open to, it's not just about chemicals and cutting, but it really is a full picture of your health and of how food is a primary means by which to medicate yourself and your relationship to your body. And here, as I'm saying these things, one person could hear this and be like, okay, here he goes. He might as well just be a middle-aged yuppie from LA talk. I mean, you can just see the wheatgrass going down.
Yeah.
That's fine. I have no judgment of that demographic. But on the other hand, I'm also mindful of Scripture that tells us over and over again, what you eat matters.
Yes.
You're connected to this natural world. Not only that, this natural world, whether that bird has a soul or not, it's worshiping, right? And then now we find out that this natural world is over 1 billion galaxies. And again, I'm totally, simplifying this, but my understanding is there are certain molecules that have been split, and when whether it's rotate or they manipulate one, they can be separated by miles, and they manipulate one, and there will be a response by another part of it. That we're continuing, science is continuing to bear out the interconnectedness of the world. And it's interesting too, the Dalai Lama has said that his favorite, outside of theology, his favorite topic is neuroscience. And we have this plethora of study about meditation.
Right.
And it is objectively proven the benefits, the physical benefits of
Yes.
meditation. This thing that's in the scripture, you've already talked about. It's like science is saying, good idea.
Yeah.
Really good idea. And then we open up the notion of the placebo effect. Now, how would you understand what we talk about when we say a placebo effect?
Yeah, the placebo effect basically being that idea that you're really giving a patient who, in some cases, a hypochondriac, but in other cases has sort of self-diagnosed, something that's not really
But
there.
if you're doing a scientific study where you're having to prove the efficacy of
Right.
a drug, wouldn't you also, some are going to get the drug and some are going to get a
not.
placebo.
Right.
And
so
why
you
is it? Why that? Why is that done?
It has to do with when you do scientific experiments, something has to be sort of the thing that's always constant.
The control.
The control.
Yeah.
And then you have all these things that are variables.
Right.
But the best science is only done with one variable at a time.
Yes.
Because there's too much multiplicity of common effect. That's not always possible, but
Right.
that's the idea.
So that you can isolate those variables to say
Yes,
that
yes, yes,
variable
yes.
matters. Here's the effect of that variable.
Right, and so that was like in the study I was doing with the biophysics of viral DNA, that's what we had to do. We were studying very, 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 very minute changes in things I was doing with virus DNA.
Right.
And so for that to happen then, I think what science has done is to say, we've always heard the church talking about, for example, prayer, and prayer having its effect on. I wonder if there's a way to examine prayer from a scientific perspective. And some have gone into that. And some have done it with mindfulness, and some have it done with meditation, which is a form of prayer. And I think one of the things that science did was it moved into an area that previously was kind of forbidden for them. And they said, well, let's dip our toes in this. And in many cases, not all, but in many cases, scientists came back out and went, you know what?
Right.
There's a connection
And
there.
it was forbidden from them because there was a two-way street. The prejudice went both directions.
It
You're a
did.
scientist, how would you believe in that hocus pocus? And then, yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah, so and a very short example of that, when I was starting to get into ministry, my pastor told me that I had to learn how to think spiritually.
You mentioned that.
And I went, those are exclusive terms. And he goes,
Yeah.
oh, no, they're not.
Yeah.
And so I had to learn how to do that. And so my two roads going different ways had to eventually join. And again, I think the positive part of that is you get the benefit of both. They're not mutually exclusive. You get the benefit of both. And so this interconnectedness that a long time ago we used to call this the butterfly effect.
Yeah, sure.
And the idea that they're connected. And we know, a butterfly floats its wings in Los Angeles. There's an effect in New York.
Chaos theory.
Probably not
Right.
physically.
Right.
But there is this combination of effects. And now we're seeing with the understanding of dark energy and dark matter, how that effect is on a cosmological scale.
Right.
It's certainly going to be on one where we say, if we keep cutting down the rainforests,
Well, yeah.
we are going to reduce the amount of free oxygen in our atmosphere. Scientific fact. I look at that as a theologian then and say, and God told us, take care of this land. And that's not doing it. There is an effect on how we're able to live.
Yeah. Well, and getting back to this, the reason I asked about the placebo effect was because in studies they also find that there are people who heal who were not given the drug.
Right.
In other words, they thought they were given the drug, and so there are questions about, okay, then what is that? How is it? And my understanding, again, I'm third party here and I'm not trained, but is that the significance of the placebo effect is such that it can't purely be explained away to say, well, that person didn't truly have the disease. Like there's too much of that. And why is this significant? Because that to me, and I'm seeing this through a lens of faith, okay? That to me points to the mind and the body's potential for healing itself. God giving us the power in that sense for faith to help heal our bodies. Also, with regards to the interconnectedness of the universe, there are emerging studies about how people, as they pray for one another, intercession. You talked about meditation and those, yes.
For yourself.
But this, and to talk about variables, now we're really getting, and this is tricky science, is that there is evidence to support that people praying for one another, be this explained as I don't know, in terms of whether it's a placebo effect, I believe, and that's helping me to heal, or if it is in some way a sign of this interconnectedness of people, that our ability to connect is a part of healing, that prayer, theoretically, there could emerge scientific proof that prayer, there is scientific proof that meditation and individual prayer works.
Right.
This question that intercessory prayer works, is valid. And I'll tell you, one of the things for me about this that is so comforting is that I personally struggle, and again, have been raised with the whole, Pentecostal and charismatic and spiritual warfare background. I struggle with the notion of God's intervention in these areas because it's so fraught to me to say, well, why did this?
Why this one, but not this one?
Right. However, in this case, ironically, I'm not going to say it's ironically, beautifully, but some would say ironically, science is opening me up to being like, okay, I could see where God would create a system in which you're all in this together. Mm-hmm. Pray for that. Pray in that way. You are connected. Be mindful of the chemicals that are in your environment because that's going to create this sickness. All these, but like I have stitched you all. You are intimately connected. So you're going to rise and fall based on that. Now that to me is a belief that I'm like, yeah, I can go to bed at night feeling like, I am, and I'm not alone.
No, you're not. And I can connect the scientific and the theological if I say, all right, one of the things that Paul said was, and God's Spirit testifies with my spirit that I am a child of God. Uh-huh. So there's my connection with God. Well, guess what? God's Spirit testifies with your spirit that you are a child of God. So if God's Spirit's doing that with me and God's Spirit's doing that with you, then there's a third-party connection between you and me and our spirits. And it may be kind of like the translators that work between two people. There's a third party there. And so the third party here is the Spirit. It's God going, I got this one.
Yeah.
I can connect you to through that spiritual connection. And if being able to do that, then when I am praying for somebody thousands of miles away for healing, and I'm praying in the Spirit, and God's Spirit is hearing that, it says God's Spirit will make intercession for us, then it's as though Spirit's saying, Damon, gotcha. Mm-hmm. Now watch this. And Spirit goes to the Father, and the Father says, you know what, Spirit? Let's touch that person over there. It happens. And it happens not from me to you, but from me through God to you. And so I think the scriptural evidence of that interconnectedness fits in with the scientific hopefulness that there is a connection there.
Mm-hmm. And I would add to that, even outside of that, if what we understand to be healing doesn't happen, the effect of that connectedness is, in my loss, the first thing I'm going to need is to lean on the connection.
Absolutely.
You see, and so in that way, just from a sociological standpoint, that thread of science is saying, do that. Is saying that works. So, all right. So, kind of an interesting journey there.
Good. We could go a lot further. Maybe we will someday.
Yeah, but it's nice to know, like, this one's interesting. There wasn't, these things aren't in conflict. And I think it's nice to be reminded that there are forces out there who want to tell us there's conflict in places where there isn't conflict.
Yep, I agree. And I think as Christians, we have to lean on the scriptures for that. And as people of the 21st century who are naturally, especially in the Western world, naturally scientifically oriented, we have to lean on that. And you don't have to choose. God created both. God created science. God created us as spiritual beings. Why would I not embrace both? And Mark doesn't know this, but talking about the mystery, so Adam's preaching this Sunday. Sunday a week from now, I'm preaching. And it's the story of the ascension of Jesus. And the title of my sermon is Embracing Mystery.
Good.
So we're going to get more of this.
Good. All right, well, as always, we'll have a follow-up conversation at noon on Zoom. Email me at mark.humphrey@coker.org if you want to jump in on that. Again, that's mark.humphrey@coker.org. And we'll see you there. Hope you're doing well. Hope you're having a great week. Check our website to see all the other things that we have going on this week. And thanks for hanging out with us. We'll see you later.
Y'all be faithful.